3,900 stairs. I was looking up at 3,900 stairs. 3,900 steep and slippery stairs cut into the mountain rock. 3,900 stairs that I had to climb. One morning last November, I began the most challenging day of my life. In the middle of the Himalayan mountains in central Nepal, looking up at those stairs. For a little height perspective, the CN Tower has 1,776 stairs. So my task that day was like climbing the stairs of the CN Tower, a little more than twice, if the CN Tower stairs were made of stone and covered in mud. I was on day 4 of a debilitating head cold, and I was trekking at an altitude I had never known before. I wanted to quit before I had even begun. After the first 1,000 stairs, my legs felt like jello, and I had to will them to take every step upwards. After 2,000 stairs, my lungs felt as though they might explode. And after 3,000 stairs, finally my resolve collapsed. I unstrapped my backpack, I threw it on the ground, and I had an enormous cry at the edge of the mountain. But then, with some encouraging words from my family and the blissful endorphins that occur after tears, I found a reserve of strength that I didn't know I had. I picked up my backpack and I strapped it back on, and I began ascending, and I made it to the top of those stairs and the mountain. Absolute glory. Hard situations, and in this instance, hard travel, make us stronger. They help us to build our mental grit. Last year, my husband John and I, and our 3 kids, Angus, Duncan, and Clementine, left our secure Canadian homes for the adventure and challenge of backpacking around the world. 9 months, 19 countries, 5 continents, 69,000 kilometers. It was the boldest and scariest and most wonderful thing we have ever done, and the most transformational. People often ask us about the genesis of this idea. Was it on our bucket list? Was it because we had traveled in our youth? Was it simple wanderlust? Well, the answer is yes. We had many motivations for travel in this manner, and not the least of which was the concept of battling entitlement. Entitlement is a hot topic these days, isn't it? How we're raising a soft, spoiled generation coddled by schools and society and helicopter parents, lives that are over-controlled and overprotected. And we were met with some opposition. Some people thought we were crazy. Why would you remove your children from their easy and cushy and predictable lives? But we are contrarians, and by choosing difficult travel, we gave our family the opportunity to foster the life skills that otherwise may have been missed or minimized in our daily lives. The opportunity to build the grit required to manage the massive changes happening in our society today. We had a few guiding principles for our adventure. We focused our time on off-the-beaten-path destinations, places uncommon for family travelers. Places such as the countryside of Vietnam, war-torn Bosnia, and the deserts of Peru. We had a small daily budget for our travels, specifically $200 Canadian each day for 5 people's food, accommodations, and most travel. And most important of all, we lived like the locals, as thoroughly as possible everywhere we went. We stayed in family homes and hostels and huts. We slept under the stars, and we slept under mosquito nets. And often, we all slept in one room. We used local transportation, derelict buses, and ferries, and tuk-tuks, and night trains. And we ate local cuisine. Barbecued crickets, chicken's feet, cow's heart, and steaming cups of water buffalo milk. We traveled hard. This was not a vacation. This was not a holiday. This was an adventure. We were in search of authentic and challenging experiences with the goal of seeing how people really live around the world. So what makes up this grit? Well, there are 5 characteristics that I observed changed in myself and our family over our journey: sacrifice, adaptability, patience, empathy, and tenacity. Firstly, on sacrifice, traveling minimally taught us to do without. For most of my adult life, when preparing for a typical vacation, I would pack it all. Shoes for every outfit, accessories for every occasion. But this journey was different. On this journey, we each had only one small 7-kilo backpack for all of our gear. I can see some looks of horror. It was almost unimaginable surviving with so little. Socks proved an interesting challenge, as we each had only 3 pair. So we learned to wear a pair, have a pair in reserve, and have 1 pair washed and drying, clipped to the outside of our backpacks. Traveling this minimally was a powerful learning experience, and we realized that often in life, the vast majority of our possessions just unnecessarily weigh us down. The second attribute of mental grit, adaptability. Sleeping in a new bed, or even with a new pillow, can often prove disruptive. Well, last year we slept in 92 different beds. And if one is to believe that personal growth comes not from comfort, but from discomfort, then on our first night in Greece, we all grew tremendously. We had booked an early morning arrival at the Athens airport, and much to our surprise, our flight actually landed several hours early, and we were without accommodations until the next day. So lacking a viable plan, and with 3 exhausted kids and 2 more exhausted adults, we decided to sleep at the airport. The air conditioning was on full, the fluorescent lights were harsh, and the music hummed just loud enough to be jarring. We had only our backpacks for pillows and our quick dry towels for blankets. As we tucked our kids into sleep that night on a damp concrete floor, John and I were filled with doubt and guilt. But we all made it through that uncomfortable night, no worse for wear, and we actually felt a pretty great sense of accomplishment. Adaptability has preserved us as a species, and it preserved us as an exhausted family at the Athens airport. The third attribute of mental grit, patience. We thought it would be interesting to take an old-fashioned local train from Malaysia into Thailand. The trip was quite inexpensive, and web reviews suggested it would be a little rustic, but pretty straightforward. A few hours into our journey, we were rolling along the countryside, listening to the clatter-clatter of the tracks, when suddenly, wham! We had hit something big. We had hit a cow. Hours later, we were back on the tracks, again rolling along, now in the darkness. It's a little hard to believe, but there was another wham! Another cow. But this time, a more serious derailment. Hours at the side of the tracks, with no information as to our plans or our timing or our next steps. Just inky darkness and a jungle all around us, and a very good opportunity to practice our patience. We realized something that night. We had been the only agitated people on that train, and we were the best equipped. Our family had food and water, even sleeping masks and decks of cards. The locals had scant resources, and many of them were elderly or had infants. So now, whether sitting on a Malaysian night train or sitting in Toronto traffic, I endeavor to take a deep breath, gather some perspective, and enjoy the journey, as unpredictable as it may be. The fourth attribute of mental grit, empathy. Rural Cambodia offered us the opportunity to deeply enhance our empathy. Cambodians have ample reason to feel jaded by life. 1 in every 270 Cambodians has an amputation from a landmine. And yet, they were the kindest, most generous, and grateful culture we encountered. Essentially the opposite of what we often deal with in our privileged Western lives. We found an opportunity to stay and volunteer on a small family farm. We were provided simple rooms and food in exchange for a small sum and a variety of farm tasks. We learned that the farm had existed for a few decades, begun when the family was exiled from Phnom Penh by Pol Pot. They had been intellectuals, but took up farming for survival. The family showed us monuments on their property, dedicated to their father and uncle, who had disappeared with soldiers one day and were never seen again. I complimented the beauty of a large lotus pond in their fields, and they told me it was actually the result of an American B-52 bomber. On our last night together, the grandmother sat with us and told us her own stories of survival during the era of the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields. Tales of walking for days with only rags for clothing, of deprivation and starvation. The oddest thing was that when we broached the subject of anger or resentment, they looked at us as though we were absurd. You see, they felt fortunate, very lucky, in fact. They were alive and had a thriving farm. This glimpse of understanding these beautiful lives was one of the greatest gifts of my life so far. And finally, number 5, tenacity. We were in our 8th month of travel, in our 16th country, and we were feeling pretty worldly and tough. Colombia replied, "Hold my beer." The Tayrona National Park lies on the northern Caribbean coast of Colombia. We decided to ramp up our threshold for adventure and go camping. The 3-hour hike into the park offered some of the best beach views we have ever seen, as well as astonishing 40-degree heat. Once we arrived in the park, we spent days exploring remote beaches and snorkeling and hiking. We were happily off the grid. Our campsite was right on the beach. Simple tents and hammocks and cold outdoor showers. But then one morning we awoke to our 3 kids quite ill. High fevers and vomiting and aching, typical gastro illness, but under very bad circumstances. As there was no possibility for communication with the outside world, no phones, no Wi-Fi, no email, we realized we were on the cusp of an emergency. Every bone in my body was saying, "Act urgently." We located a man with some horses, normally used to bring supplies into the campground. With very rusty Spanish, we desperately negotiated with Carlos, who agreed to bring our kids on horseback to a jungle medic about an hour and a half away. So with 3 wobbly, nauseous kids on horses, and John and I carrying the packs and jogging behind them, we made it to the jungle medic. After a few hours of care, IV fluids and pain meds, we again propped our kids on horses and headed for the park exit. Our son Duncan was still too ill and weak to stay on his horse, so 6 men carried him out of the jungle on a stretcher. We were in the hospital for 3 days. I became ill within minutes of arriving in the emergency room and have often wondered since if some sort of maternal instinct simply did not allow my body to become ill until we knew our children were safe. The hospital was a frenzied place. It was loud and bloody and chaotic and dramatic. But this story has a happy ending. We were safely out of the jungle and completely healed within a few days. And our insurance agent is still laughing at our claim, which includes a receipt for emergency horseback evacuation. And now we are home. And the landscape in which we find ourselves looks remarkably similar to the one we left, but we feel so different. Some days the changes feel slight, and sometimes they seem staggering. With our adventure, every routine was altered, and a typical day was never a typical day. And the further outside of our comfort zone we traveled, the more profoundly changed we felt. We achieved our goal. We saw a meaningful slice of how people really live around the world. And we've returned home feeling irreversibly transformed, more open-minded and more gritty. So I leave you with this. If a life of deeper mental grit is your goal, then perhaps make things a little more challenging and give hard travel a try.